Steve Harvey had been hosting Family Feud for over 12 years, and throughout that time, he had encountered every imaginable personality type that could appear on a game show stage. He had met the gracious winners and the sore losers, the nervous competitors and the overconfident players, the supportive families and the contentious ones. However, on that particular September afternoon in 2024, he was about to come face to face with a type of behavior that would challenge his professional composure and demand that he use his platform to address a toxic pattern that destroys marriages and families across the country. Before we explore this important story about accountability and respect in relationships, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel so you can continue to receive content that reminds us why personal responsibility and mutual support are essential foundations for any healthy partnership. The Coleman family from Portland, Oregon stood prepared to compete against the Ramirez family from San Diego, California. Dennis Coleman was 44 years old and worked in sales for a technology company, though his employment history showed a pattern of frequent job changes and positions that never quite lived up to his own assessment of his talents and capabilities. His wife, Linda Coleman, was 43 years old and had maintained steady employment as a registered nurse for over 20 years, providing financial stability for their family even as Dennis moved from one opportunity to another in search of the success he believed he deserved. Their 3 children completed the family unit on stage. Jessica was 19 years old and attending community college while working part-time to help pay for her education. Ryan was 16 years old and excelled in academics despite the tension he had learned to navigate at home. The youngest, Kelly, was 13 years old and had developed a quiet, watchful personality as a result of growing up in an environment where conflict often simmered just beneath the surface. Linda Coleman had approached this Family Feud appearance with mixed feelings of excitement and apprehension. She had always enjoyed game shows and had encouraged her family to apply when she saw the casting call announcement. She hoped that this experience might provide an opportunity for her family to work together toward a common goal and perhaps remind Dennis of what they could accomplish when they supported each other rather than falling into their familiar patterns of blame and resentment. Linda had spent 2 decades trying to be supportive of her husband's various career pursuits while simultaneously serving as the steady financial anchor for their family. She had encouraged his entrepreneurial ideas, celebrated his new job opportunities, and consoled him through the inevitable disappointments and setbacks that seemed to follow each venture. What she had not fully acknowledged until recent years was that her support had gradually transformed from partnership into enabling, and that Dennis had developed a convenient habit of attributing his failures to everyone and everything except his own choices and actions. The game had progressed through the first 2 rounds with a competitive energy that seemed promising. Both families were engaged and enthusiastic, providing answers that ranged from successful to humorous, and the studio audience was responding with appropriate applause and encouragement. Steve Harvey had been delivering his signature reactions and maintaining the upbeat atmosphere that made Family Feud consistently entertaining. The Coleman family held a slight lead as they entered the 3rd round, primarily due to strong performances from Linda and their daughter Jessica, both of whom had provided several top answers that accumulated points efficiently. The question that would change the entire trajectory of the game and the atmosphere in the studio came during the 3rd round when the families were competing for control of the board. Steve Harvey read from his card with his characteristic enthusiasm and perfect comedic timing. We asked 100 people to name a reason someone might not get a promotion at work. The question was straightforward and designed to elicit common workplace-related responses that most people could relate to through their own experiences or observations. The survey board began to reveal answers as family members took their turns, showing predictable responses such as poor performance, attendance problems, attitude issues, and lack of qualifications. Dennis Coleman was standing at the podium when his turn arrived in the rotation, and the question was posed to him directly. Steve held the microphone toward Dennis with an expectant expression, ready to respond to whatever answer would be provided. What happened next was so unexpected and so revealing of deeper problems that it would transform the game show moment into something far more significant and uncomfortable. Dennis appeared to think about the question for only a brief moment before responding with absolute confidence, and not a trace of self-awareness about how his answer would be received. "A nagging wife who doesn't support your career goals," Dennis said, and the words landed in the studio with an impact that was almost physical in its intensity. The smile on Steve Harvey's face froze and then slowly transformed into an expression of profound disbelief. The studio audience responded with an audible gasp followed by uncomfortable murmuring as people processed what they had just heard. Linda Coleman's face registered shock and hurt, her expression clearly showing that this was not the first time she had been blamed for her husband's professional shortcomings, but perhaps the first time it had been stated so publicly and with such casual cruelty. Steve Harvey stood silent for a long moment, his legendary quick wit apparently failing him as he processed the audacity of what Dennis had just said. The production crew in the booth looked at each other uncertainly, wondering whether this was going to become another one of those moments that required intervention beyond typical game show hosting. Steve's face went through a progression of expressions that clearly showed his internal struggle between maintaining his professional entertainment persona and addressing what he recognized as a deeply problematic statement that revealed serious issues in this man's character and marriage. Finally, Steve found his voice, though it carried none of the lightness and humor that typically characterized his hosting style. "I'm sorry, can you repeat what you just said? Because I want to make sure I heard you correctly before I respond to it." His tone made it clear that this was not a simple request for clarification, but rather a demand for Dennis to consider his words and perhaps recognize their inappropriateness before doubling down on them. Dennis, however, seemed completely oblivious to the warning implicit in Steve's response and the disapproving energy that had filled the studio. "I said a nagging wife who doesn't support your career goals," Dennis repeated with the same casual confidence, even adding an elaboration that made the situation worse. "You know how it is. You want to take a risk or pursue an opportunity, but your wife is always worried about money and stability. It holds you back from achieving your potential." His additional commentary revealed not just a moment of poor judgment, but a deeply ingrained belief system that blamed his spouse for his own failures and absolved him of responsibility for the consequences of his choices. The expression on Steve Harvey's face shifted from disbelief to barely controlled anger. He took a visible breath, clearly making a conscious decision about how to handle this moment and what his responsibility was as someone with a platform and an audience of millions. When he spoke, his voice was controlled but carried an edge that everyone in the studio recognized as serious and potentially confrontational. "Brother, I'm going to stop you right there because we need to have a conversation about what you just said and what it reveals about how you think about your marriage and your wife." Steve turned to address Linda directly, his voice softening with compassion and concern. "Ma'am, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me and with yourself. Is your husband blaming you for his career problems?" Linda's eyes had filled with tears, but she nodded and found her voice despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "Yes, he does this all the time. Every job he leaves or loses, every business idea that doesn't work out, every opportunity that doesn't pan out the way he expected. Somehow it becomes my fault for not being supportive enough or for being too concerned about our financial stability and our children's needs." Pain in Linda's voice was evident to everyone listening, and it clearly reflected years of accumulated hurt and the exhaustion of being made responsible for someone else's failures. Steve nodded with understanding and empathy, then turned back to Dennis with an expression that had transformed from entertainer to moral authority. "Dennis, I'm going to tell you something right now, and I need you to listen carefully because this is important not just for this game show, but for your marriage and your family. What you just said on national television reveals a fundamental problem with how you think about success, failure, and responsibility." Steve's intervention was just beginning, and his voice carried the weight of someone who had learned hard lessons through his own experiences and was committed to speaking truth even when it was uncomfortable. "When you blame your wife for your career failures, you are doing several things that are destructive and unfair. First, you are refusing to take responsibility for your own choices and actions. Second, you are making your wife responsible for outcomes that she has no control over. Third, you are poisoning your marriage with resentment and blame instead of building it with accountability and partnership. And fourth, you are teaching your children that it is acceptable to blame others for your own shortcomings rather than learning from failures and working to improve." The studio audience responded with enthusiastic applause, clearly in agreement with Steve's assessment and appreciative of his willingness to address the issue directly rather than glossing over it for the sake of entertainment. Dennis's face had begun to change color, showing a mixture of embarrassment and defensive anger as he found himself being called out publicly for behavior that had apparently gone unchallenged in his private life for years. He attempted to interject, to defend himself or minimize what he had said, but Steve raised his hand in a gesture that clearly communicated this was not yet time for Dennis to speak. "I'm not finished," Steve said with firm authority. "Let me tell you what I see when I look at your family. I see a wife who has worked as a nurse for over 20 years, providing steady income and benefits for your family, even while you have moved from job to job looking for the success you think you deserve. I see children who are watching their father blame their mother for his problems instead of taking responsibility for his own choices. I see a woman who has supported you through multiple career changes and business ventures, and this is how you repay that loyalty and dedication, by blaming her for your failures on national television." Steve turned to address Linda again, and his voice carried both compassion and a challenge for her to recognize her own value and the unfairness of the situation she had been accepting. "Ma'am, I want you to hear me clearly right now. You are not responsible for your husband's career outcomes. You are not holding him back from success by wanting financial stability for your family. You are not nagging when you express legitimate concerns about risky decisions that affect your children's well-being and your family's future. You are being a responsible partner and parent, and you deserve appreciation for that, not blame." The tears were flowing freely down Linda's face now, but they seemed to be tears of relief and validation rather than just pain. Perhaps for the first time in years, someone was acknowledging that her concerns were legitimate and that she was not the problem in this dynamic. Her daughter Jessica had moved closer to her mother and placed a supportive hand on her shoulder, clearly recognizing the significance of this moment and wanting to show her support and solidarity with the parent who had been unfairly blamed and criticized. Steve then returned his attention to Dennis, and the disappointment in his expression was profound and unmistakable. "Dennis, let me ask you some direct questions, and I want honest answers. How many jobs have you had in the past 10 years? Dennis hesitated before responding with clear reluctance. "Maybe 7 or 8 different positions." Steve nodded and continued. "And how many of those jobs did you leave voluntarily because you thought you deserved better, versus being let go for performance or attendance issues?" Dennis's face showed that this question had hit a nerve, and his answer came slowly. "Most of them I left because I felt undervalued or because the opportunity wasn't what I thought it would be." Steve's response was immediate and pointed. "So you have had 7 or 8 jobs in 10 years, and most of them you left because you felt they weren't good enough for you. And during all of this time, your wife has maintained steady employment in a demanding profession, providing stability for your family. But somehow she is the one holding you back from success." The rhetorical question hung in the air, exposing the absurdity of Dennis's blame and the fundamental unfairness of his perspective. The studio audience was completely engaged now, recognizing that they were witnessing not just entertainment, but a real intervention in a troubled marriage dynamic. Steve's voice became even more serious and direct as he delivered what would become the most quoted part of this entire exchange. "Let me tell you what real success looks like, Dennis. Real success is not about jumping from job to job chasing some fantasy of the perfect opportunity where everyone recognizes your genius and pays you what you think you deserve. Real success is showing up consistently, performing with excellence, building relationships, earning trust, and advancing through demonstrated value rather than entitled expectation. Real success is being a partner who supports and appreciates the person who has stood by you through all your poor decisions and failed ventures." Steve paused to let those words sink in before continuing with even greater intensity and conviction. "Your wife is not your enemy or your obstacle to success. She is the woman who has loved you enough to stay with you through all of this instability, who has worked hard to provide for your family while you pursued your various ideas and opportunities, who has raised your children to be respectful and hardworking despite the example you have been setting. The fact that you can stand here on national television and blame her for your failures shows that you have completely lost perspective on what matters and who is really responsible for your situation." Dennis attempted to defend himself, his voice taking on a defensive and slightly aggressive tone. "You don't understand the full situation. You don't know what it's like to have dreams and ambitions and feel like your partner doesn't believe in you." His attempt to reframe himself as the victim of insufficient support, rather than the author of his own problems, revealed how deeply ingrained his patterns of blame and deflection had become over the years. Steve's response was swift and uncompromising, shutting down Dennis's attempt at justification with clear moral authority. "Brother, I'm going to stop you right there, because that is exactly the kind of thinking that is destroying your marriage and holding you back from any real success. Your wife has believed in you enough to stay married to you through multiple job changes and failed ventures. She has believed in you enough to work full-time in a demanding profession while you figured out your next move. She has believed in you enough to raise your children and maintain your household while you pursued your ambitions. What you are really saying is that she doesn't believe in you in the specific way you want, which is blind, uncritical support for every idea and decision regardless of how it might affect your family's well-being. The studio had fallen into complete silence except for Steve's voice, which carried the weight of truth that was uncomfortable but necessary. He continued with increasing passion and conviction. Let me tell you what your wife deserves. She deserves a husband who takes responsibility for his own career outcomes instead of blaming her when things don't work out. She deserves a partner who appreciates her steady contributions to your family's stability instead of resenting her for having legitimate concerns about financial security. She deserves to be valued and respected instead of being made the scapegoat for your disappointments and frustrated ambitions. Steve turned to address the studio audience and the cameras directly, using this moment to speak to anyone watching who might be engaging in similar patterns of blame and deflection. Ladies and gentlemen, I want everyone watching this to understand something important. When you are in a marriage or any serious relationship, you are partners. That means you support each other, you encourage each other, and yes, sometimes you challenge each other when you see them making poor decisions. A good partner is not someone who blindly supports every idea you have. A good partner is someone who tells you the truth, who helps you see your blind spots, who encourages you to be your best self rather than enabling your worst tendencies. He continued addressing the broader audience while keeping Dennis clearly in his line of sight. When your partner expresses concerns about your career decisions or your financial choices, that is not nagging or lack of support. That is partnership. That is someone who cares about your family's well-being enough to speak up even when you might not want to hear it. And when you respond to that legitimate concern by blaming them for your failures, you are not just being unfair to them. You are sabotaging your own growth and success by refusing to take responsibility for your choices. Steve returned his focus to Dennis with one final direct challenge and call to accountability. Dennis, I'm going to give you a choice right now. You can continue down the path you are on, blaming your wife for your career problems and poisoning your marriage with resentment and deflection. If you choose that path, I can almost guarantee you that you will continue to experience job instability and career disappointment, because people who refuse to take responsibility for their failures never learn the lessons they need to achieve real success. Or you can make a different choice. You can stand here right now and apologize to your wife for blaming her unfairly. You can commit to taking responsibility for your own career outcomes. You can choose to appreciate and value the woman who has stood by you when most people would have given up on you. The challenge was clear and direct, placing Dennis in a position where he had to make a choice in front of millions of viewers about what kind of man and husband he wanted to be. The studio audience waited in silence, and Linda stood with her children surrounding her, all of them watching Dennis to see how he would respond to this moment of accountability. Dennis's face showed a complex mixture of emotions including embarrassment, anger, defensiveness, and perhaps the first glimmers of genuine self-reflection, as Steve's words penetrated his habitual patterns of blame and justification. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 30 seconds of silence, Dennis spoke with a voice that had lost much of its earlier confidence and defensiveness. You're right. I've been blaming Linda for things that are my responsibility. I came up here and said something that was completely unfair and hurtful, and I can see now that this is a pattern I've been repeating for years. His admission was halting and uncomfortable, but it represented at least an initial acknowledgement of the problem that Steve had identified. Steve nodded but pressed for more specificity and direct accountability to Linda rather than a general admission. That's a start, but I think you need to say this directly to your wife, not to me or to the audience. She's the one you blamed and hurt. She's the one who deserves to hear you take responsibility for your behavior. Steve's insistence on direct accountability, rather than abstract admission, reflected his understanding that real change requires specific acknowledgement of harm done to specific people. Dennis turned to face Linda fully, and for perhaps the first time since they had taken the stage, he seemed to actually see her rather than viewing her through the lens of his own resentments and justifications. When he spoke, his voice carried more genuine emotion than it had before. Linda, I'm sorry for what I said up here today, and I'm sorry for all the times I've blamed you for my career problems. You've been working hard for our family for years while I've been jumping from one job to another, And instead of appreciating that, I've resented you for wanting stability and security. That was wrong, and I can see now how unfair I've been to you." Linda nodded, tears still streaming down her face, but her expression showed both relief at hearing this acknowledgement and wariness born of years of disappointment and broken promises. She responded with a voice that carried both hope and appropriate caution. "Thank you for saying that. I hope this is the beginning of real change, and not just something you're saying because Steve called you out on television. I love you, but I can't keep being blamed for your choices and their consequences. Our children are watching and learning from how we treat each other, and I don't want them to think this is what a healthy marriage looks like." Her response demonstrated both her capacity for forgiveness and her determination to set boundaries and expect real change rather than just words. Steve nodded with approval and respect at Linda's measured response, recognizing her wisdom in accepting the apology while also making clear that words alone would not be sufficient. He addressed both of them together with guidance that reflected hard-earned wisdom about relationships and personal growth. "Listen, both of you need to hear this. What happened here today was painful and uncomfortable, but it can also be a turning point if you choose to make it one. Dennis, you need to follow up this apology with real changes in how you think about success, responsibility, and your wife's role in your life. That means taking ownership of your career outcomes, seeking professional help to understand why you've developed these patterns of blame, and learning to value and appreciate what Linda brings to your partnership. Linda, you deserve to expect real change and to set clear boundaries about what treatment you will and will not accept going forward. You've been loyal and supportive, but loyalty doesn't mean accepting blame for things that aren't your fault." The episode concluded with the game continuing in a subdued atmosphere, the earlier entertainment energy having been replaced by something more serious and reflective. The Coleman family did not win the game, but as they left the stage, there was a sense that something potentially more valuable than prize money had occurred through the uncomfortable but necessary intervention that Steve had provided. As they walked off stage, Linda's children surrounded her protectively while Dennis walked slightly apart, clearly processing the public accountability he had experienced and the choice he now faced about whether to pursue genuine change or retreat back into familiar patterns of blame and deflection. When the episode aired 6 weeks later, the response was immediate and overwhelming in both volume and intensity. The clip of Steve Harvey shutting down Dennis Coleman's blame of his wife went viral across all social media platforms within hours, generating millions of views and passionate commentary from people who connected with the dynamic that had been exposed and addressed. The overwhelming majority of responses praised Steve for his intervention and expressed support for Linda, while condemning Dennis's behavior as representative of a toxic pattern that many people recognized from their own relationships or observations. Women shared their own stories of being blamed by partners for failures and setbacks that were not their responsibility, finding validation in seeing this dynamic called out so directly and publicly. Relationship counselors and therapists used the clip as a teaching tool about patterns of blame and deflection in troubled relationships, the difference between support and enabling, and the importance of personal accountability for one's own choices and outcomes. Career counselors noted that Dennis's pattern of frequent job changes combined with external blame was a classic indicator of someone who had never learned to take responsibility for their own professional development and success. However, there was also commentary from some viewers who felt that Steve had been too harsh, and that Dennis's initial answer might have been intended as humor rather than a serious statement of belief. Steve addressed this criticism directly in subsequent interviews, standing firmly behind his decision to intervene and refusing to accept the excuse that harmful statements could be dismissed as jokes. When someone says something like what Dennis said, they are revealing their actual beliefs and attitudes. You don't joke about your wife being responsible for your failures unless on some level you actually believe it. And even if it was intended as humor, which I don't believe it was, it's the kind of joke that reveals and reinforces toxic attitudes that damage relationships. The Coleman family gave an interview 4 months after the episode aired, providing an update on how Steve's intervention had affected their marriage and family. Linda spoke about the difficult but necessary conversations that had followed the taping, the decision to enter marriage counseling, and the ongoing process of establishing healthier patterns in their relationship. Having our problems exposed on national television was mortifying in some ways, but it was also the wake-up call we needed. Dennis couldn't minimize or dismiss what happened because millions of people had witnessed it and responded to it. That public accountability forced us to actually address issues we had been avoiding for years. Dennis spoke about the humiliation of being called out so publicly and the difficult process of confronting his own patterns of blame and his resistance to taking responsibility for his choices. Watching that episode was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Seeing myself through the eyes of millions of strangers who were rightfully critical of my behavior forced me to recognize things about myself that I had been avoiding. I had to face the fact that I had been blaming Linda for my own failures, because it was easier than admitting that I was the common denominator in all my job problems and career disappointments. He continued with what appeared to be genuine insight and commitment to change, though Linda's careful expression suggested she was still in the process of determining whether his words would translate into sustained behavioral change. I've been in individual therapy working on issues of accountability and self-esteem, and we've been in couples counseling learning how to communicate more honestly and supportively. I've also stayed in my current job for 4 months now, which is longer than I've stayed anywhere in years, and I'm actually working on building relationships and demonstrating value rather than looking for the next better opportunity. It's hard work, but I'm beginning to understand that real success comes from consistency and excellence, not from chasing fantasies of perfect opportunities where I'll finally be recognized and appreciated without having to earn it. The Coleman children also reflected on how the public intervention had affected their understanding of relationships and personal responsibility. Jessica spoke about how witnessing the confrontation had helped her recognize patterns she wanted to avoid in her own future relationships, and had given her language to describe unhealthy dynamics she had observed but not fully understood. Seeing my dad called out for blaming my mom helped me understand that what I had grown up thinking was normal actually wasn't healthy or fair. It made me think about what I want in a future partner and what kinds of behavior I will and won't accept. Ryan noted that the experience had taught him important lessons about taking responsibility for his own choices and outcomes rather than blaming others when things did not go as planned. I realized I had picked up some of my dad's patterns of making excuses and blaming external factors when I didn't do as well as I wanted in school or sports. Watching him get called out made me more aware of when I was doing the same thing, and I've been working on taking ownership of my results instead of finding reasons why they weren't my fault. The incident sparked broader cultural conversations about patterns of blame in relationships, the difference between support and enabling, and the particular dynamic where one partner becomes the scapegoat for the other's failures and disappointments. Therapists noted that this pattern was especially common in relationships where one partner had more career stability than the other, with the less stable partner often developing resentment and blame toward the more stable one, rather than examining their own patterns and choices. Marriage counselors reported an increase in clients bringing up issues of blame and deflection after seeing the Family Feud episode, with many people recognizing their own relationships in the dynamic that had been exposed. Some were the blamed partners seeking validation and support for setting boundaries, while others were the blaming partners who had been challenged by family members or friends to examine their own behavior after watching the episode together. Steve Harvey reflected on the incident in multiple interviews and speaking engagements as one of the most important interventions he had made during his years hosting Family Feud. I've had a lot of memorable moments on that show, many of them funny and entertaining. But the day I shut down Dennis Coleman for blaming his wife for his failures, that stands out as a moment where entertainment had to take a back seat to moral responsibility. That man needed to hear that his behavior was wrong. His wife needed to hear that she wasn't the problem, and their children needed to see that there are consequences for treating people unfairly, even when that person is your spouse. The story of the husband who blamed his wife for his failures and the game show host who shut him down became more than a viral moment. It became a cultural reference point for discussions about accountability in relationships, the destructive nature of blame and deflection, and the courage required to call out unfair treatment even when it is uncomfortable or unpopular. It reminded everyone who witnessed it that success in any area of life requires taking responsibility for your own choices and outcomes rather than searching for external factors and people to blame when things do not go according to your expectations. As this powerful and instructive story concludes, the essential lesson remains clear and relevant for anyone navigating relationships or career challenges. Personal accountability is not optional for success or healthy relationships, but rather the fundamental requirement for both. When you blame your partner for your own failures, you accomplish nothing except poisoning your relationship and ensuring that you will continue to fail because you never learn the lessons that failure is meant to teach. If this story has resonated with you or challenged you to examine your own patterns of blame or accountability, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that remind us about the values and behaviors that build strong relationships and successful lives. Share this with someone who needs to hear this message, whether they need encouragement to stop accepting unfair blame or a reminder to take responsibility for their own choices and outcomes.